So my son struggles sometimes with getting overwhelmed when he opens up his homework. And I imagine that some of you have probably had the same problem as you have opened up the first discussion case and looked at some of the things that I want you to read. Because a lot of these things look intimidating, they look really academic, and you're worried. He wants us to read this much. What am I supposed to do with all this information? And even though I think I've given you a case study that lays everything out pretty clearly, what I want you to do, it is a lot, right? I understand. I empathize. I have been a student. I was in your shoes not that long ago. And what's more, I reviewed these articles and dozens more just like them in putting these packets together. So I get it. But I'm here to tell you there is a way to get through this. And that, first of all, is to understand how to read these kinds of articles before you start actually delving into them. And I'm going to give you a few tips right off the bat. The first thing is to try to understand what the big picture idea of the article is. And sometimes this is really easy because there'll be an abstract at the beginning or a summary that explains what you're going to be reading. Other times it's not so clear. And what you might need to do is skim the article. And I find it is generally best to read the introduction and the conclusion and then go back and look at what's in the middle. Maybe make note of any charts or any kinds of graphics or anything else that's included that's intended to help you to understand what's in there. Because a lot of times what you're going to find is that once you have a sense of what an article is about and you go back and you start reading it again, it's a lot easier to read. Another thing is I want you to be very wary of the fact that a lot of pieces that are written by academics or by really, really bright practitioners tend to use words that have a precise meaning in their scientific field, but which are not necessarily words that mean a lot to you. And an example I could offer that's kind of similar to this is that many people, when they're reading about statistics, as soon as they start to see any kind of mathematical notation, like a Greek letter or something like that, get thrown off and they stop reading because they know they're not going to understand what they're reading. It's actually not a good idea. What you should do is learn what that notation means and then go back and try to do the reading and try to understand what's being said. In this case, you're going to see words that are very academic. Just look them up, figure out what they mean. Try to figure out what the plain English word for them is. And I'll give you a couple of examples as we're going through this today. So I'm going to take you over the next 20 minutes or so through all of the articles that are signed for this first packet. And I'm going to do this every week. Just give you some highlights because I think that if you hear me talking about them and you understand why they are in this packet and why I think they're important for you, you will get more out of them. And so we're going to begin by talking about the history of qualitative research methods by Sidney J. Levy. And Sidney J. Levy is a big name in the world of qualitative research. In fact, the book that this and several of the other readings come from, he was the editor of. And so when you see this name, understand there's some credibility here. This is somebody who you should listen to, someone who spent a lot of time doing scholarship about this topic. And what this chapter is ultimately about is helping you to understand where qualitative research comes from, how it's been used in practice in marketing research, and then also kind of the pendulum swing back and forth between qual and quant, and how they've both been used in different types of uh, lines of questioning that have been developed to get answers about consumers. And one of the things that you will find is that a lot of what is in here is pretty modern. It comes from, for the most part, the 20th century. But an area where you really want to begin to pay attention is when you see sections like this, the rise of qualitative research, or maybe you want to pay attention to something called motivation research, because motivation research really popularized and created new styles of qualitative research that are still in use today. And we don't call it motivation research anymore because a lot of what qualitative came out of was high-end academics applying their trade in the business world. But as you begin to read, you're going to see all kinds of different techniques and ideas and influencers that came up throughout this history. Now, I'm also going to say this particular article can be kind of like reading the Bible sometimes. And if you've ever read the Bible, you know that it's full of names and genealogies and things like that. And just look at this page here. I mean, all these different things that are being referred to, articles and people's names and dates and things like that that aren't important. These are the areas where you skim. What you're really interested in is understanding what these movements of people contributed to qualitative research and how they contributed to ideas in marketing, such as things like the brand image. So pay attention to those kinds of details. That's what you're going to get out of this. And I would say hold on to this one as a reference, because later on in your career, you might need to go back and look at the history a little bit to understand where different people and ideas came from. And this article has them all. The next that we're going to look at is qualitative research in advertising. And this is another historical piece that is written by someone who really knows her stuff, Linda M. Scott. And what is, I think, a little bit more interesting about this article is that she did a meta review of a lot of different journals. And what she was trying to find was how qualitative work was being represented. And some of them did a better job than others, she says, of talking about qualitative research. And part of the problem is that qualitative research has never been taken as seriously in a lot of the journals as quantitative research has. And so she's arguing that, yes, there is actually an important history here, particularly in the realm of advertising, and let's understand a little bit more about how qual fits in. And one paragraph that I will point to you right away is this one right here. It says, the areas that I will examine in this chapter are responses of readers to advertisements, the practices of professionals in the creation of advertisements, the evolution of advertising as an art form, and the theory of criticism as advertising as a social influence. Now, I'm sure in your background you took at least one advertising class or a class about advertising. You probably did not get a real good review of the history of advertising beyond some very practical general stuff. So this is a great article for bringing you up to speed and for helping you to understand where these things came from, where these different ideas came from, and how qualitative research has intersected with them. So read through this, understanding that those are the 4 areas that you really need to understand. The next one is the researching the cultures of brands. This article can get a little wordy at times because it's, again, referring to a lot of scholarship. But one of the things that I found really useful in this article was on page 4. Let me scroll down to it here. So we first of all have this chart, which I'm going to circle back to in a minute. But one of the things that they say in this article is that is actually, I'm sorry, on the 6th page of the PDF here, it says, there are essentially only 2 ways of conducting studies within the social sciences: hanging out or asking questions, or, as he puts it, interviewers construct data, observers find it. So this is kind of a framework behind a lot of what is discussed in this article as they're talking about brands, because brands are complicated ideas. And one of the things that they talk a lot about in this article is the difference between looking at brands from a management point of view and then looking at brands from a culture point of view. And this chart right here is important for kind of thinking about that framework, because it talks about all of the different influences that occur on what a brand ultimately means. And all of these different audiences are telling stories that are ultimately going to impact the brand. So as you're looking at this, think about, as a qualitative marketing researcher, how important it is for you to understand the perspective that different audiences have on brands and what they mean, and also how important it is for you to be able to identify and navigate where those perspectives are coming from, so that you can put together a comprehensive understanding of what those brands mean. This article will give you the tools that you need in order to be able to do that. And again, don't get thrown off by any of the larger words that they use or some of the concepts they use that can be a little bit off-putting. Instead, read through this trying to really understand what are these different perspectives and where is this tension between brand management and consumer culture, and how can I, as a researcher, disentangle those 2 things and look at them from different perspectives. Okay. This next article is about case research, and this one is probably the most formidable in this packet, just because it starts off right away. Since Hippocrates first presented 14 classic case studies of disease some 2,300 years ago, you know you're in for a good time when you start off with ancient Greece, just as you knew you were off for a good time when we started talking about Galileo in this class. So what I want you to understand about this article, though, is that it is making a case that there are really 2 different types of scientific inquiry, and it's actually mentioned right here. One involves formulating a tentative theory of phenomenon writ large, deducing implied empirical consequences. So in other words, things that you can observe and notate and record as data. and then controlling situational events in order to observe the validity of empirical deductions, which is experiments. Okay, so quantitative collection of data and experimental design are that first idea. The second path, less frequently used but equally valid, is to reason from individual and naturally occurring but largely uncontrollable observations towards generalizable inductive principles. In other words, qualitative research. So, what he's essentially saying here in this first paragraph is that there really are two different ways of looking at scientific inquiry, quant and qual, and they're both useful, but one is less frequently used and is kind of kicked around and considered not as useful. And in discussing this, he's not telling us anything we don't know, right? But in discussing this, he's going to talk a lot about the use of case research. So we have this really cool diagram here that I would encourage you to spend some time reading through, studying, and trying to understand before you go back to this article, because this article actually spends a lot of time explaining what is in this knowledge accrual triangle. So think about it this way. We have data integrity on one side, low to high, and we have currency, or the amount of usefulness, on this other side, from low to high. And so in terms of our currency usefulness to us as individuals, we like things that are myths and legends. We like things that are stories. We like things that are archives or personal opinion, in different variety in terms of how much they help us to navigate the life that we're living. But those are all things that are non-scientific. So they're not things that we can really use in a way that helps us to understand the truth of the world. What we can do, though, is we can look at some of these other scientific areas, and you're going to notice that some of the things that provide the highest level of data integrity also don't have as much currency to us in terms of helping us understand kind of the bigger picture of things. So laboratory experiments, they have a high level of data integrity, but a low level of currency. They're really good and they're really useful for understanding particular things, but they don't really give us those broader cultural understandings of things. And models and simulations are kind of right up there. When we get down to things like field experiments, field studies, and case research, though, they have a much lower level of data integrity. They're still science. They're still useful, but they are going to give us a lot more currency. And see, when I see a diagram like this, what I immediately think is, well, gee, maybe combining some of this kind of understanding here with some of this kind of understanding here helps us to overcome the weaknesses of both and allows us to get a lot more out of the exercise. Now, one thing that I would also note is surveys on his knowledge accrual triangle are pretty low down in both, and I would say that there is some truth to that. Surveys are not tremendously useful for much of anything beyond a very basic understanding, and they tend to have a low quality of data associated with them unless they're collected really deliberately and carefully. So keep that in mind. So as you're looking at this piece, think about that diagram. And then there's another one that comes up a little bit later. And again, so when you're skimming and you're kind of looking like, what can I understand? This is a cool idea where he's talking about the different stages of understanding in case research. So as he's defining case research in this article, he's really kind of talking about something that one word for it might be like a super anecdote. It's not quite an anecdote. It's a little bit better than that, but it's also not really a piece of data that has been collected. When he's talking about cases, he's talking about things that come from interviewing people and talking about outcomes that came from a problem resolution, or he's talking about hearing about how resolutions came through. And of course, we all know about case studies from many classes that we've taken where we look at a problem and then we look at all of the available information about how that problem could have been solved, and then we look at maybe even how the problem was solved. Cases are going to fall in that territory, although they may not always have as much information as a case study might. So what he's saying here is that there's really 4 different levels of understanding that happen within a case research project. And I just encourage you to read through this to try to understand exactly what it's saying. We have the early, middle, and late stages of the project and where these different stages occur. And try to map this to what he's actually describing here in the text. And I think you will find that if you continue to look back at this diagram, what he's describing in the text will begin to crystallize and make a little bit more sense for you as you're understanding how he's applying case research to building ultimately a deeper understanding, or he calls it model theory creation, of a topic. Okay, Our next article is about projective techniques, and I know, you look over here on this side and you see something in a foreign language and you go, what? What is he expecting me to read here? Well, that's only on this one page, and actually everything else that's in this article is in English. And this is an article where you're going to have, you're going to find a very thorough write-up of projective techniques. It's interesting and it has some intersection with some of the things that we have already read about. But if I were you, I would go ahead and recommend skipping ahead. Read the introduction and then skip ahead a little bit, skim until you get to the fifth page of this PDF. And on the fifth page, what you're going to find are case studies. So it says 3 case studies are discussed below to illustrate the use of projective techniques as a research tool. So read these case studies and try to understand a little bit about how projectives were used in specific concrete situations and what the researchers did. And I think once you have read through this, and then you go back and you read through the things on the pages that precede it, these projective techniques will make a lot more sense to you. What I really like about this article is that it's thorough and it covers all the bases in terms of talking about how projectives can be used. It talks about how they can be analyzed. It talks about their limitations. It talks about everything that a researcher would need to know, broadly speaking, to use them. And it even goes into some detail about how they're able to transcend communication barriers, which is, of course, the primary reason for using them. So there's a lot packed into this article, and it's actually only a 7-page article. It's not as long as it looks. But every now and then you're going to run into words like this one, phenomenological. What does that mean? Oh, well, when you look it up, what this word really means is this something along the lines of unnatural or unexpected or novel. And again, this is a word that comes from the field, phenomenological, I can't even say it, research really has to do with trying to understand things that are unnatural or unexpected or which come kind of out of the blue. Just understand that what it's really saying is something along that line, something that's unusual, unnatural, novel, or insightful. And when you see words like that, just try to substitute in your mind the appropriate meaning to help you to understand what the person is actually saying so that you're not thrown by those words. Okay, moving on. Let's pretend. So this is another article about projective methods, and in this article, there is a historical outline that begins with this very tantalizing rise, fall, and revival of projective methods. So when you hear something got popular and then it fell out of favor and then it came back, that usually means that there is something that happened there that is interesting, and that's kind of what you want to search for, is what happened. Why did projective methods fall out of favor, and why did they come back? And in this case, you're going to see some names that are very familiar from some of the other articles that we've read, people that helped to revive these techniques as they rediscovered them and found that there were new uses for them that hadn't been considered before. So some really useful things in this particular article are in tables, actually. And this table helps you to understand where the different projective techniques can be categorized and where they came from. So if you hear about things like word association or sentence completion or symbol matching, which are very well known and commonly used throughout the field of psychology, you can go back and find out where they came from. And if you are so inclined, you can go and do some research into learning more about where those came from. But you can also just be aware how long ago some of these were developed and when they actually came into use. One of the techniques that's a little bit more modern, for example, is collage construction, and there are 2 different practitioners that develop different systems to be able to do that. But some of the other things like word association or thematic storytelling or psychodrama come from a different era, and so in some ways they might need to be updated if they're going to be used rather than used in a classical sense, because the culture has changed so much since then. So this arms you with a lot of good information about how to use these techniques and how to define them and categorize them. A couple of other useful tables that are in this, which again, read these tables and then go back and read the text. One of these tables talks about, okay, if you're doing this type of survey or this type of interview or this type of data collection, use these projective techniques because they're going to be the most useful for it. So if you're doing a written response, word association, sentence completion, or cartoon tests make the most sense, right? If you're doing a written narrative, stories or dream exercises or things like that make more sense. If you're doing something where you're more visual, symbol matching or picture drawing or collage construction can be really useful. And if you're asking people to act things out, psychodrama is really useful. So using different modes in order to apply these projective techniques, you find there's some natural fits, and this really helps to provide some guidelines in terms of when you're designing a study, what is most useful. Also, in terms of um, the uh, the type of data that you're going to get. You're going to get pretty easy stuff from word association, sentence completion, cartoon test, and symbol matching. It's going to be pretty easy to deal with. But when you start getting into things like collage construction or thematic stories, dream exercises, psychodrama, or auto driving, you're going to have to spend a lot more time with the data, and everything else is kind of in between. So again, looking at these different projective techniques and understanding, here's why I would use these. And just because something sounds cool doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right thing to use for every type of research that I do. This is a great resource. Okay, I'm going to get to go through the last of our detailed articles here, and then I'm going to talk about a few of the practitioner articles. So this article looks a lot longer than it is. If you looked up here and saw this one is 20 pages long, you might freak out right away just by the amount of information that you're going to be asked to read. But I'm going to warn you right off the bat, you don't have to read 20 pages. In fact, almost half of this is either bibliography or a chart that we'll talk through in just a moment. The idea of this article is really important, and I would say of all of these, this is probably the one that is most thematically important for many aspects of our class, because what we're talking about is here is the distinction between collecting data and presenting data in a really abstract form and building a story or a context around how those data were collected so that the audience is able to make better sense of why you collected those data and what you did with them. And one of the sirens calls of qualitative research is having a really great story to tell that can illustrate everything that you learned in a way that your audience can understand without having to show them just reams and reams of data. It's really powerful, and if you can come up with a metaphor or an analogy or a story to tell that helps people to understand what you learned, they will remember it and internalize it and utilize it a lot better than if you just show them lots and lots of data. So the problem, however, is that when you are sharing a story or a context with people, that's the part they tend to remember. And I can tell you just from my own lecturing in this class that when I go back and talk to students who remember being in my class, often what they will remember more than the information I shared are the stories that I told. And sometimes those stories are useful, sometimes not so much. So storytelling is powerful, and it can help us. And one of the things that they go through in a lot of detail in this article is why it's important and why we really should consider using it and how it can help us to tell people deep insights about the research that we have conducted and help them to become better users of it. But also the dangers. And one of the biggest dangers that they talk about comes from the field of anthropology, and it's a term you've probably heard before. It's called going native. And as we read through some case studies in this class, and you get to pick one of 5 this week as part of this assignment that are all mentioned in this article, one of the things I want you to think about is, did the researcher get to a point where they are no longer able to be objective about what they're talking about here because they went native? They got too close to the culture they were trying to study, or maybe they started out too close to it and they weren't able to be objective. So keep that in mind, and this section here, how to make context work for you, is particularly important. This chart here is useful to study, and if you are struggling with some of the terminology and wording, talking about the 4 different quadrants here that they've kind of broken things down into is helpful. I know it looks a little intimidating when you first see it, but I think when you read some of the text and you come back and look at this chart, it'll begin to make a little bit more sense to you. And then another thing that's useful is looking at these are all different articles that they're all studies that were published. They all have a unique context, and some of these are the ones that I assigned, like the funerals in Ghana or the fantasy card gamers or things like that. So you can look at, this is what they were trying to communicate. So in this study on illiterate consumers' marketplace behaviors, they were trying to communicate consumers manage their stigma through their marketplace choices and behaviors. And ideally, what we want people to walk away from hearing about this story, is that illiteracy is stigmatized in North America. So the story is pointing towards a conclusion, but there's data there that is being supported as well that's helping to discuss this theory of stigmatization. So the context is just kind of the bread on the sandwich of the study, but it's what's inside that really matters. Bread on its own is delicious, but it's not that useful for making, or it's only useful for making a sandwich, right? I mean, you can eat it on its own, you can make toast out of it, but if you're going to make a sandwich with it, you got to have things in between that really make that sandwich something special. And that's kind of how it works here too. The theoretical payoff is the stuff that's in between the slices of bread. So look at some of these different situations where context was used to talk about a theory like subculture theory or consumer branding theory or consumer resistance or community or things like that. And then look at how that context, that story that was centered at the beginning and end of the, and sometimes in the middle of the research, is then used to make the research more palatable to the rest of the audience. So as I said, there are many pages of articles that are cited, and then there's even more in the bibliography. Read through this and try to get an understanding of what's there, and I think you'll find a lot of value. Now, I do want to mention 3 other articles that are in the lighter reading folder, and these come from a couple of different sources. One is Quirk's Marketing Research Review, which if you are not familiar with them, they are the magazine for marketing researchers. You can get a free subscription to it. Just go to their website and make sure you are signed up, and they will mail it to you every month. I don't particularly love these articles. I think they are a little outdated, and I know you're like, oh, well, you're the one that assigned them. But the reason that I am using them is because I want you to understand how practitioners think about some of the issues that we're talking about. And this one in particular, so this is from 2013, so it's almost 10 years old, but it's talking about a subset of millennials who they have dubbed Gen I. Now, nobody calls them Gen I anymore. Everybody calls them like late millennials or, some other name, 90s kids, things like that. But they have other names. But the idea here is not the nomenclature. It's understanding how to engage this audience. And because a lot of the people that were in this group at the time of this article were young, it talks a lot about how you have to be engaging and maintain attention and think about different ways that you can change up the way the research is conducted, the way that you can think about how the person you're interviewing is going to evaluate you as you are interviewing them. And there's a lot of different tips and tricks and ideas here, including being familiar with technology, which in 2013, people were still getting on board with some of the things that we take for granted today. And some of the things that we take for granted didn't exist in 2013. So understanding the social tools of the culture is important. There was no TikTok back in 2013 when this article was written, but you'd better know about it today if you're going to talk to younger people in case they reference it. So this is a good practitioner article that also offers some ideas about different props or tools like apples to apples cards or internet searches or challenges or post-it exercises, things that you can use that can help to engage that audience. The next article is talking about how to get millennials to dig deep, and this one comes from 2015. So again, it's a little bit older, but this is still a useful article because it talks about some really specific techniques that have been used to get younger people to open up and to share things about themselves in a way that is authentic to them as participants. And so offering them different types of prompts and different types of statements that they can make about themselves is one of the things that it talks about. And then also recognizing that there are factors that contribute to the way that we live our lives, like money, health, time, and technology, and using that as a framework to talk to this group. There's this very humorous Millennials a primer here, which some of this is already pretty outdated. For example, millennials are moving back to suburbs now that they're getting older. But this is helpful again at just understanding how a practitioner looks at a new or emerging subculture and tries to figure out ways to connect with them. This one comes from QRCA Views. QRCA Views is the magazine of the Qualitative Researchers Consultants Association, and this one's about millennials and the changing consumer landscape. And it's short; it's only 2 pages, but it just kind of offers some different perspectives. I think it's a little condescending at points. I really hate when millennials are called Generation Me, for example. Being a very close to millennial myself, because I was born right on the cusp of when the millennial generation begins, I've always identified with millennials, and I hate the idea that millennials are self-absorbed or in some way different from their parents just because their parents don't like the fact that they occasionally assert themselves. It's just really condescending and rude. But what I do think is interesting about this article is that they reference a lot of research and then they talk about some of the social trends that were impacting millennials when this piece was written. And it's helpful, again, this is from 2015, at just thinking about this generation a little bit differently. So I hope that this review has been really helpful for you. I hope that it's at least gotten you excited about reading some of these articles. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. If you are struggling with any of these, don't feel bad. Sometimes you have to read them a few times to really get them, but the more that you take time to try to dissect them and understand them, the more use you will get out of them. Good luck.